this great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
In the early 20th century, after the end of World War I, the American economy started its roller coaster ride. In the 1920s, unemployment began to grow as the country was being flooded with immigrants. Diversions like motion pictures, amusement parks, flapper girls did not last very long. Good jobs at all socioeconomic levels began to disappear. Farmers began to suffer with consecutive seasons of no rain and thus no crops. America was heading for a depression. And then President Herbert Hoover, along with Andrew Mellon, his Secretary of the Treasury, talked of non-intervention by Washington. He favored letting the private sector work things out for themselves, and his government became isolationist. The stock market crash of 1929 did not cause the Depression. It was simply the tipping point. The bottom fell out of the American economy with banks closing, virtual Dust Bowl conditions in the middle of the country, and home foreclosures becoming the norm. Shantytowns called Hoovervilles sprung up like wild mushrooms. Herbert Hoover did not stand a chance in the election of 1932. A popular East Coast politician, well-educated and well-spoken, grabbed the hearts of the American voter, and Franklin Roosevelt won by a landslide. We're here this morning with Professor Mark Santow from the University of Massachusetts at Dartmouth. Dr. Santow, Mark, pleasure to meet you.
It's good to meet you as well.
Dr. Santow is a professor of American political history in the 20th century. You're the perfect person to talk to, not only about the WPA, but about all of the politics and policies of FDR and the New Deal. I'd first like to ask you to comment about the 1920s and the events that led up to what we call the Great Depression. What went on back then?
Okay, well, there's a variety of different things that caused the Depression. I think most of us, when we're growing up, we hear that it was the stock market that essentially triggered it. But in many ways, that's kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. Throughout the 1920s, there was a great deal of inequality within the United States. It parallels in some ways our own time. Great deal of financial speculation on the stock market and in the housing market. The financial markets were almost completely unregulated at that point in American life. So a great deal of debt and risky loans and so forth. And so that's part of what toppled the economy. But underneath that was the simple fact that we were becoming a mass consumer economy, an economy that really needed American citizens to have enough money to spend in order for it to move forward and to keep, providing a decent life for most citizens. And wages simply weren't keeping up with, the price of things. So ultimately, inequality had a lot more to do with the crash of the Great Depression than the crash of the stock market.
Is it fair to say that the October crash of the stock market was the tipping point and that threw everything into chaos?
Yeah, it certainly was. I mean, you can't miss the fact that unemployment was quite low in October of 1929, just before the crash, and then by Christmas, 4 million people had lost their jobs, something like that. So, just within the span of a few weeks, the kind of house of cards had sort of toppled over. Much like in recent times, the collapse of Lehman Brothers, one could argue caused our economy to crash, but it really didn't. It was just kind of the last straw, so to speak.
How much blame do we put on business back then in the 20s?
Well, I mean, you could put blame on business. I think you could put blame on government as well. I mean, the presidents of the 1920s who were Republican, they had the same Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, throughout the 1920s, who was one of America's wealthiest men. he insisted on reducing what little regulation there was of the financial system, cutting taxes on the wealthy and corporations, which did cause a kind of speculative boom, sort of like we just saw in our own country in the last decade or so, before 2008 anyway. There was also an effort by business to try and roll back the gains of labor unions and workers that had taken place during World War I. In order to have labor peace during World War I, so we could keep producing for the war effort, unions were able to kind of gain a little bit of power, and workers were able to gain a little bit of power. And then in the wake of World War I, there was an effort by employers to try and roll back the power of unions and to essentially break them, so that by the time we get to 1929, the percentage of American workers who belong to unions is about 6 or 7%. It had been about twice that at the end of World War I. So workers didn't really have the power to bargain for higher wages or better hours or any of those things, and it wouldn't happen until the middle of the Great Depression, pretty much. So certainly you can put some blame on business, but business, corporations are legal entities. Their sole purpose is to make money for their shareholders, and that's what they did. Certainly there was some dishonesty, particularly in the financial sector, just like there was in our own time. But ultimately, I think you could argue the government has a responsibility to make sure the rules are such that when corporations do what they do, it doesn't do great harm to the rest of us.
It's been said that Hoover didn't stand a chance of getting reelected. His basic philosophy was hands off for the government, whereas whoever came in to replace him, in this case FDR, was more of a let the government step in with an alphabet soup of programs under what he called the New Deal. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, certainly Hoover, by the time he's running for election, is, the Democrats could have put up with virtually anybody, I think. And Roosevelt ran the sort of campaign where he did talk about the idea of a New Deal. I mean, he came up with it during the campaign, the phrase. But he revealed very little about the specifics of what the New Deal would entail, because Roosevelt knew that the less that he, put out there in the way of specifics, the better his chances were of defeating Hoover. And Hoover was a tragic figure in a lot of ways. I mean, he, of course, was vilified at the time and has been since. And if you, go see, Annie the musical, there's all sorts of songs about Hoovervilles. And Hoover's indifference and his inability to sort of convey empathy to the American people hurt him politically and hurt the country, I think. But, I mean, Hoover had been known for most of his career as a brilliant man, an organizer, a progressive, someone who was capable of actually running government efficiently and enabling government agencies to do well. He was the Secretary of Commerce in the 1920s. He'd been in charge of food relief for starving people in Europe in the wake of World War I. I mean, this was, this was no dummy. He was one of the brightest men to hold office in the White House. But his ideology had clearly been kind of bypassed by events, and the events were just so stunning and so sudden. By the time of the election in 1932, you have unemployment rates of 25%, 3 times what we're facing now. In many industrial cities, unemployment rates over 50%. And this is a time before there's no welfare, there's no food stamps, there's no unemployment insurance, no 8-hour day, none of that stuff exists. Most Americans, even before the Great Depression, are essentially working people. I mean, they're, going paycheck to paycheck, more or less. And that's before the Great Depression. So, Hoover's ideology was that government should remain small. To the extent that government should do anything about the Depression, it should be to try and encourage business to do something about the Depression. And so, he was ill-equipped, and he didn't have the communication skills either, which nowadays we understand this. We just watch this presidential debate and all the weighing of, which one conveyed, what, and a lot of it's not about policy. It's about sort of emotion or the optics of the thing. And, that's not American politics in 1932, but the radio is playing a big role. Most American homes that have access to electricity have access to radio by 1932. And Hoover just doesn't seem to be able to convey to the American people a sense that he cares. And Roosevelt, grew up in a much more kind of patrician, aristocratic background than Hoover did. I mean, Hoover's a farm kid from Iowa. Roosevelt could convey that. is just simply individual charisma, the ability to express himself in clear language, and it mattered.
So along comes this upper crust Democrat from upstate New York and walks into the White House. What does he do in the first few weeks of his administration?
Well, I mean, an extraordinary range of legislation over the first, the legendary 100 days, where a lot of the modern American state was essentially built in that 100 days. The most notable early thing he did was the bank holiday, because within a week or two before his inauguration, the banking system was essentially collapsing all around the country. Banks were closing in state after state after state. There were riots and acts of violence and runs on the banks as people were trying to get their money out. And Roosevelt feared the entire collapse of the financial system. And the bank holiday was a couple of states had already done bank holiday, so he didn't invent that. But basically, they closed the banks for a few days, and Roosevelt, this actually conveys what I was talking about a second ago, Roosevelt went on the radio and essentially explained to the American people how banks work, which we probably could use now, I think. What he basically said is that, when you put your money into a bank, that bank then loans it out to your neighbors to create businesses and build houses. And, just because your money isn't in the bank at that particular moment, it's out doing things that will help boost the economy. And everybody needs to just, calm down. I mean, if you remember his inaugural address, he said, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." And he basically told the American people to trust him. That when the banks are open, if we are calm and we understand how banks work, the system will be there and your money will be there.
Did it work?
And it did work. 3 months later, they passed the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation Act, the FDIC, which federally guaranteed deposits below a certain amount. So the federal government sort of backstopped the security of the banks.
But that's the same FDIC that remains in place today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the limits of what they guarantee has obviously changed. But they put that in place 3 months later. But there was no run on the banks when they reopened them after the holiday. So it did work. And Americans saw that it worked, and it was an enormous political gain for Roosevelt, which enabled him to pass a lot of what was passed in the next 3 months. So.
FDR came up with more than a dozen three-letter agencies, for the lack of a better term, everything from the CCC, Civil Conservation Corps, to Tennessee Valley Authority, to where we're sitting right now, with WPA, Works Progress Administration, that basically was designed to put men and women to work. Did it work, or was it just a feel-good thing?
No, it did work. I mean, it didn't end the Depression. So I guess it depends upon what your rubric is for, measuring what worked. But he came in with an unemployment rate of 25% by the time he runs for re-election in 1936, which is about a year or so after the WPA is created and Social Security is passed and so forth. The unemployment rate is a little more than half that. So I think the way to think of the WPA is sort of in, sort of three ways. One has to do with Americans' confidence in the solvency of the country, ultimately. I mean, anything seemed possible in March 1933 when Roosevelt took office. I mean, after all, Hitler's taking power at the same time. Fascism and militarism are running rampant throughout Europe and Eastern Asia. Democracies and capitalist democracies seem like they won't survive. And things like the WPA enabled us to get away from that kind of crisis mode and to feel like we were doing something, which is not what it felt like when Hoover was president. So in that sense, it made a difference. In another sense, it put millions of people to work. I mean, I don't have a graphic to show you, but if I could show it to you, and when you look at unemployment in the private sector, it is coming down during Roosevelt's first term, but it remains very high. But if you include the public sector jobs and the WPA jobs and the Civil Works Administration jobs, the unemployment rate, in fact, drops quite a bit. So it had an enormous impact on unemployment. Anyone who was on relief, which we would call welfare today, was eligible, to get a WPA job, one person from every family. The pay was low. It was very low. It was intentionally low, so it wouldn't compete with the private businesses that were doing the same kind of work. But it's a paycheck. And when a person gets a paycheck, they spend the paycheck. They go to buy food, they pay their rent, they buy clothing, which puts money back into the economy, which presumably puts more people to work. So The WPA certainly worked in that sense, and of course it worked in terms of giving people a sense of dignity, which the dole, as people called it back then, or welfare as we would call it now, Americans by and large didn't want that. Roosevelt hated the idea of the dole or relief, and loved the idea of this kind of, of what the WPA did and what the CCC did as well. He had done something similar when he was governor of New York. He felt it gave people dignity to be able to work. And not just to work, some of the criticisms of the WPA was that, they were hiring people to dig a hole and then other people to put the dirt back in, sort of a makeshift work, but that's really not what the WPA did. The WPA, it was a way to contribute to your country as well, and there's a sense of dignity to that as well.
What ended all of these programs, WPA and all the others?
World War II is sort of the short answer to that. I mean, the WPA did persist just barely into World War II. I think it ended in 1943. And in the last couple of years of the WPA, once unemployment dropped, which it pretty much did by 1940 or so, and the Depression effectively ended, the WPA didn't disappear yet. The WPA workers rebuilt the military infrastructure in the country. Fort Devens, not too far from here, bases all around the country were rebuilt and revamped by the WPA. Roads and highways, which were useful for moving supplies and troops back and forth. So the WPA sort of shifted gears. Roosevelt gave a famous speech after the 1938 congressional elections, which he said, after 1940 rather, when he said, I'm changing from Doctor End the Depression to Doctor Win the War, to describe himself. And the WPA shifted gears in the same sort of way. But it's the same kind of work. I mean, it's basically building the bones of the country, or rebuilding it.
New Bedford is particularly fortunate in the fact that back then we had a mayor named Charles Ashley, who had some pretty high contacts in Washington and in Boston. And New Bedford received probably more than its share of WPA projects, which is why we have so many other buildings and public infrastructure, things like this bathhouse complex. I often wonder how we wound up with that, and I have to just tell myself it was because of one mayor, and it was the friendship of one mayor. Do you know anything about that? Or
I don't know about him. I do know that it did matter whether you were politically connected or not. I mean, the WPA, one of the things that Republicans were always criticizing the WPA for is they were worried that Roosevelt would act like a city machine politician and essentially use the WPA to employ Democrats and not Republicans. And the evidence doesn't indicate that he did that. But if you were a prominent Democratic politician, or just simply a politician that Roosevelt happened to like Fiorello LaGuardia in New York, it was not a Democrat, but was a friend of Roosevelt's, you were more likely to get projects than other places were.
Last question. In your opinion, do you think that whole depression could happen again?
Yeah, I certainly think it could. I mean, I think for a lot of parts of the country, it feels that that's sort of where we are right now. Some of the things that were put in place in the New Deal are still there. I mean, there are some things that were kind of undermined or weakened in the 1990s, which actually in part led to the financial crisis that we recently suffered. Some of the banking regulation was weakened. But today, one of the reasons why we don't have as many Americans starving and homeless today as we might is because of unemployment insurance, is because of food stamps. I mean, you just heard in the presidential debate the other night the numbers that there were something like 30 million Americans using food stamps before the recession, or before Obama took office. Now there's 47 million, and you can look at that two ways. One of them is it's a measure of how bad the economy is, but another is it's a measure of the fact that Americans can continue to feed themselves in an economic downturn, which simply wasn't the case during the Great Depression. I mean, you had mass starvation, particularly in agricultural, in rural areas, child malnutrition and so forth, that the federal government didn't have the capacity to do anything about. So, could we have another depression? Yeah, I think so, because some of the same causes that created the Great Depression of the 1930s played a role in the present economic downturn.
Yeah, I think about they called it the Dust Bowl, and we've got just about the same thing with the Midwest, the breadbasket of America, not getting enough rain and compounding it with all the other things. Yeah. But it makes you pause and give wonder to what can happen. Dr. Santel, I want to thank you very much for taking time out of your schedule. It's a pleasure to have you here and to meet you.
Fun.
And look forward to seeing you on the air.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
America, here is a record of it to judge for yourself. City streets pounded by ever-increasing traffic are modernized, resurfaced, thousands of blocks which mean huge savings in local tax money. Vital to the communities which they serve are the thousands of miles of highways, constructed and improved by the Works program. The need for first-class highways grows constantly as the automobile and the motor truck become increasingly important in both city and rural commerce. In many regions, great loss has befallen farmers and other rural residents during periods of bad weather which made secondary roads impassable. The need for adequate farm-to-market roads, which would make the transportation of farm produce independent of weather conditions, has been recognized in all parts of the country. But not until the beginning of the Works program was it possible to initiate a general plan for the development of farm-to-market roads. This plan brings immediate improvement in local business and property values wherever a secondary road is completed. At last, the farmer finds it possible to reach his market over well-constructed, weatherproof roads. In all these construction projects, local labor is employed, and wherever possible, the raw materials are obtained from quarries in the immediate vicinity. How big is the WPA road program? In its first 18 months of operation, the mileage end to end would have stretched 5 times around the earth. In many parts of the country are regions which depend largely upon the tourist's trade as a local industry. Areas of great scenic beauty have been made available to thousands of visitors through the development of systems of roads in national and state parks and at other centers of attraction for tourists. Many of these vacation spots were completely inaccessible before the assistance of the Works program made road construction possible. The welfare of the community served by a new construction project is always the first consideration, and plans are laid not only for the present, but for the more demanding future. In the field of public health, many important and permanent improvements have been undertaken. The water resources of thousands of cities and towns have been expanded by the construction of reservoirs and water supply systems, ensuring an adequate supply of water for the community's needs for many years to come. A particularly interesting example of a long-felt need met by the Works program is this reservoir at Atlantic City. Although this resort entertains millions of visitors every year, it never has had an adequate water supply until this reservoir was built. Another type of permanent construction is this community stadium, representative of a large group of projects that provide facilities for public gatherings all over America. In cooperation with other federal agencies, many important improvements have been made under the Works program at the Brooklyn Navy Yard and other centers of government activity. As an aid to traffic, hundreds of new bridges have been completed, designed to withstand high waters and the pounding of heavy loads. Thousands of other bridges have been repaired and made safe. Many cities have been freed from the peril of disease by the provision of modern, scientifically correct sewage systems, which often replace antiquated systems entirely inadequate for the needs of the community. Developments such as these are always undertaken with the cooperation of the public health agencies serving each locality, and the projects are carried out under the supervision of competent sanitary engineers. The rapid growth of air traffic outdistanced airport for hundreds of cities seized the opportunity offered by the WPA to build or improve modern airports. One of the busiest of all airports is at Newark. This field is the eastern terminus of all of the great transcontinental airlines, and hundreds of transport ships land and take off from its runways every day. At Newark, as at a great many other cities, the Works program has provided jobs for thousands of workers in the improvement of existing facilities and in new construction. At Cleveland Great Industrial Center, emergency work built an immense landing mat, the largest single piece of paving in the world. At Detroit, both construction and improvements were completed. Second largest of American cities and first in transportation is Chicago, where an extensive program of airport improvements have given the city adequate air terminal facilities. Philadelphia is third among our cities in population, yet this Pennsylvania metropolis has never had its own airport. Passengers bound for Philadelphia by air have been forced to land in another city, in fact in another state. Not until the Great Works program became a reality was it possible to begin the construction of this air terminal on the site of the Faint Island shipyards. The increase in air transportation has also made necessary the development of hundreds of emergency landing fields along the regular flying routes. Frequently the need for these fields is greatest where the work of preparation is most difficult. But safety in passenger transport requires the clearing of fields at frequent intervals. In the larger cities where the concentration of population is greatest, slum clearance projects have been undertaken. In some areas, new modern housing developments will be erected, providing better living conditions for workers in the low-income groups. In other locations, the land cleared will be used for public parks and playgrounds. In all parts of the country, the letters WPA are a symbol of progress and improvement. On buildings under construction, they mean the replacement of inadequate public facilities by new, well-planned structures. On buildings under repair, they mean the preservation of existing structures for greater utility. Many thousands of such jobs as these dot the map of the United States, giving work and hope to people who can't find jobs, impetus to retail trade and heavy industry, and permanent improvements to a host of communities for the years to come. Not only was it necessary to find employment for workers accustomed to manual labor, but also there was need to employ others whose training and experience fitted them for professional and other skilled work. For these so-called white-collar workers, each community had to plan jobs which would utilize and preserve their skill and training. And above all, the work must be useful, a real contribution to the welfare of the community. In planning traffic control for congested cities, jobs have been found which require varying degrees of skill. In the study of traffic problems, the first step is to determine the number of vehicles passing a given point. Then experts are employed to lay out new routes and regulations which will ensure greater safety for both motorists and pedestrians. Manpower for hundreds of such surveys is provided by the Works program. Tests have been devised to determine the ability and fitness of drivers so that the element of human failure may be eliminated. In cooperation with the police departments of several cities, automobile inspection stations have been established in an effort to reduce the number of unsafe vehicles on the road. Under the supervision of expert mechanics, every safety device is carefully checked for perfect operation. The laws of many states and cities require a regular inspection of this nature, and the possession of an up-to-date inspection label is necessary before the car owner may use his automobile on the streets and highways. Another example of useful employment is found in the sewing rooms operated by the Works program in practically every city in the country. Expert craftsmanship is encouraged in design groups associated with the sewing projects. Women who are the principal support of their families are paid for their work, and the millions of garments and miscellaneous articles they produce are distributed free to families on relief or to tax-supported institutions. For some of the women who work in these sewing rooms, the training and practical experience they receive will not only make them better housewives, but it may also open up avenues to a permanent source of income. Many other types of employment are provided for women. In a number of weaving projects, instruction is given in an interesting and useful craft. Part-time employment is provided in many kitchens where clean, wholesome school lunches are prepared for undernourished children of needy families. In libraries and schools, skilled workers are employed in repairing and rebinding millions of books. In many places where books were hard to find, over 2,000 traveling libraries now supply the demand for knowledge and entertainment and general health supervision. No other medical assistance of this nature is available. The nursing projects bring health and happiness where formerly death and misery were all too common. Their visits run into the millions. New interests have vanquished the darkness of despair in the lives of thousands of sightless men and women as a result of several projects in which books and maps have been translated into Braille, the written language of the blind. The proofreading of these works is done by sightless experts. In some cities, instruction is given in the reading of Braille maps. The tragedy of blindness has been the lot of thousands of our people in region glaucoma. A dread eye disease is prevalent. Many of its victims are prevented by poverty, isolation, or infirmity from receiving medical attention. To these people come visiting nurses, examine suspected cases, and provision to free clinics. With this assistance, medical science has found it possible to control a disease which is a menace to young and old alike, in many cases affecting every member of a large family. Needless to say, the staff necessary to maintain this important service is recruited from the trained workers of the regions concerned. And again, useful employment is combined with an enterprise of great and immediate value to the community. Everyone is familiar with the fine work being done by the famous Warm Springs Foundation in the cure of children crippled by infantile paralysis. To thousands who would otherwise be hopeless cripples for the rest of their lives has been given the chance to overcome their handicaps. Much of the success of the treatment given at Warm Springs and elsewhere depends upon the existence of therapeutic pools in which patients may gradually recover the use of their muscles through exercise made easier by the support of warm water. In many parts of the country, WPA labor has constructed pools such as these, and trained WPA workers make up the staffs which assist in the medical treatment. This therapeutic pool is in the James Whitcomb Riley Memorial Hospital in Indiana, made doubly interesting by Riley's immortal poem about the little crippled boy with curvature of the spine. In hundreds of cities, the Works program safeguards the health of many thousands of normal children of preschool age. In nursery schools, the children of needy and working mothers are provided with the best of care and medical supervision. Projects which are part of a broad educational program in which the WPA has helped millions of children and adults. Supervised play activities and preschool training under competent instructors removed from the relief roles are part of the schedule at each of these nursery schools. Meals are provided for the youngsters, and plenty of health-building milk and orange juice is consumed during the mid-morning and mid-afternoon luncheons. The food is prepared under the supervision of dietitians, and at all times a careful check of the health and development of the children is maintained. In these nursery schools, acquire habits which will guard their health later in life. Here is a work which lays the foundation for a new generation of good citizens. Another part of the Works program enters the field of adult education, and this subject embraces a number of widely varied projects. Some of the most interesting of the WPA projects in adult education are the classes in which hundreds of thousands of foreign-born people learn the language and customs of their adopted country. Vocational training projects are another branch of the adult education program. Many classes established in which instruction is given to men and women who will find very practical uses for their newly acquired knowledge in their daily lives. Every effort is made to adapt the instruction to the need and native ability of the student. Women are instructed in the arts and crafts for which they are best fitted, as exemplified in the millinery classes. In the same general category, we find classes for men in which the students are initiated into the art of tailoring. Through the training they receive here, they will be enabled to take up a profitable trade which will assure them of work and independence. A project which combines rehabilitation and education is found in the many household training classes operated by the WPA. Here, future housewives are instructed in homemaking, and inexperienced girls from relief families are given training which will make them self-supporting. As the girls master each branch of household art, their progress is indicated on a chart. Upon graduation, the girls are placed through an employment service conducted by the Works program. To the young people of the nation, eager in their quest of knowledge, the Works program, in cooperation with the National Youth Administration, offers part-time employment to enable them to continue their education. The type of employment offered is determined by the needs of the community in which the young people live. In fruit-growing districts, canning units have been set up in which girls can and preserve fruit for local householders. Part of the product is distributed to families on relief. An interesting project in New England is that in which boys, many of them from seafaring families, are engaged in the catching and breeding of fish and the restocking of fishing grounds. As they cast their nets into the sea, the action symbolizes their search for education, security, the simple riches of life. And toward this objective, the normal heritage of every young American, the Works program offers them a helping hand.
The Woffinger building on New Bedford's Pier 3 was built by WPA labor. Its purpose was to house the staff in charge of the city's waterfront. In the 1940s, a room was added to serve as an auction place for the daily catch of scallops and fish. To build this and other buildings, older mills were carefully deconstructed, and their bricks and solid timbers made of strong Georgia yellow pine were used. Warming houses at the city parks were built for use by ice skaters in the winter and swimmers in the summer. They remain, now being used as community centers for senior citizens. In what was once an outlying part of the city, WPA workers toiled for years to build a wall around rural cemetery more than a mile long. At the city's zoo, a bear pit and a bear den were constructed from giant boulders, some of which remain in place today. The city infirmary, later the Poor Farm, was enlarged, and a giant garage for city vehicles was added by the WPA workers. In the center of the city, a police traffic tower in the shape of a lighthouse was constructed at a parking lot to the north of City Hall. It was carefully disassembled in 1982 and moved to a busy intersection now known as the Octopus. It remains as a point of interest rather than a functional structure. Buildings and roadways remain today as memories of a time when America struggled out of depression and into World War II.
My most immediate concern is in carrying out the purposes of the great work program just enacted by the Congress. Its first objective is to put men and women now on the relief rolls to work, and incidentally to assist materially in our already unmistakable march towards recovery. For the first time in 5 long years, the relief rolls have declined instead of increased during the winter months, and they are still declining. In spite of these facts, however, unemployment remains a serious problem here as in every other nation, and it is because of this that we've come to recognize the possibility and the necessity of certain helpful remedial measures. These measures are of 2 kinds. The first is to make provisions intended to relieve, to minimize, and to prevent future unemployment. The second is to establish measures, the practical means to help those who are unemployed in the present emergency. Our Social Security legislation is an attempt to answer the first of these questions, and our work relief program the second. We're losing no time in getting the government's vast work relief program underway, and we have every reason to believe that it should be in full swing by the autumn.